In the fall of 2004, I packed my car and got ready to leave and headed off for Benedictine College, where I attended my undergraduate studies. As I attended Benedictine College, in our first week, we were required to go to a week of orientation events, as many colleges do these days. At Benedictine, it's called Rock Week, Raven Orientation Camp. And just like many other colleges, it's a week of learning about the college, learning about its culture, learning about the customs and the traditions in the community of that college. But also is a time about learning about the Benedictines as well. It's a wonderful opportunity and experience to learn about Benedictine spirituality, particularly Benedictine hospitality. Saint Benedict, who founded the Benedictines, wrote a rule for their living in community. In this rule, he has an entire section on hospitality. And he begins the section on hospitality by saying, "All guests who present themselves are to be welcomed as Christ. For he himself will say, 'I was a stranger and you welcomed me.'" Hospitality is a common theme throughout our scriptures. And in a very particular way in the Old Testament, when hotels and motels didn't necessarily always exist, or they existed in a much smaller way, people depended upon hospitality of others, sometimes even strangers if they're traveling long distances. And when they would approach this stranger who was allowing them to stay at their place for a day or two, the provider of the place to stay also had to realize that they had animals and feed their animals, as well as provide a bed for all of these strangers and provide food. Abraham does this very thing in our first reading today. Abraham sees these three strangers on the horizon and runs out to greet them. The story almost makes it seem as if Abraham is just waiting for another stranger to come so that he can offer them hospitality. Unbeknownst at the time to Abraham, these three strangers would end up being the three angels of God. And these three angels of God were bringing a message to Abraham and to his wife Sarah. And the important message that God's promise will be fulfilled in Abraham and Sarah. The promise, the covenant, that Abraham would be a great name and be a great nation. And his descendants would be many. Abraham and Sarah, childless, needed this promise from God. And the angels were the messengers to Abraham to tell him that this time next year, your wife would be pregnant. Abraham continued to welcome them into his home, and he went out and actually even killed the fatted calf. He went way above and beyond for these three strangers. Even unknowingly, he was serving God. There's a great iconographer who captured this scene in icons, in a very famous icon, in which these three angels actually represent the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And thus, in the icon and in this story, in a way, Abraham is serving God. Just as St. Benedict's rule says, all guests who present themselves are to be welcomed as Christ. The story of this hospitality continues actually in the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, the writer says, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." Of course, referring to Abraham. And so this ought to make us question ourselves, how are we hospitable to people in our own parish? How are we hospitable to those that we meet in the store, those who provide goods and services to us in the community? How are we showing this Christian hospitality to everyone that we meet? Hospitality is the virtue of kindness and generosity towards guests. It is characterized by the spirit of welcome to visitors and strangers, and is even a condition of salvation. As we heard in the rule of St. Benedict, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. That's a command of Jesus, that if we don't welcome the stranger, we will be judged according to that. A few weeks ago, I was at a youth conference called One Bread, One Cup at St. Meinrad Seminary in Meinrad, Indiana. And although the youth that we took, Father Ryan and I took 4 young men from across the diocese who potentially have a calling to the priesthood. And so the purpose of this conference was to introduce them into a deeper way into the liturgy and offer some training in the liturgy. But while these 4 young men were off at their conferences and their sessions, they also offered conferences for the youth ministers who brought their youth from their parishes to speak to them about what is going on in youth ministry today. One of the speakers told this story. She said she has a sister-in-law who got a great job in a town that is outside of where she normally would know people. And so in this great job, she also then, of course, found a great parish, the nearest parish to where she was living. She attended this parish, and she sat in the same spot every single week for 3 weeks. She sat by the exact same people. She recognized their faces the 3 weeks that she was there. And in those 3 weeks, not once did anyone ever come and greet her or welcome her to the parish. Not once. Her sister-in-law, because she met some non-Catholics, they invited her to their church, and she no longer goes to the Catholic Church. I don't think that this is an isolated event. In fact, I know it's not. It's actually quite common amongst former Catholics. Part of their story of why they leave the Catholic Church is because I was never welcomed there. And that word for welcomed can mean a couple of different things. It can mean that, well, I don't feel comfortable in the Catholic Church because I don't like the teachings. And that's not something that we can change. That's something that Christ inspired through the Holy Spirit. But secondly, truly, what they're saying is, I was never offered hospitality. And I think as Catholics, we get in this mindset that, well, it's a rule of the Catholic Church that I have to be at Mass. So I go to Mass, and everyone else who is Catholic ought to be there too. And so I just go and I fulfill my requirement, and I get along with my day. But that's not the fullness of who we are as Catholics. That's not the be-all and end-all of who we are. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Christ reminds us in the Gospels. We hear the story in the Gospels of Martha and Mary. It's a very familiar story. You probably typically hear homilies about how Mary chooses the better part because she's sitting at the feet of Jesus. And in a sense, she's entering into contemplation of the things that Jesus says, which is an appropriate interpretation of that gospel. But we also sometimes forget about Martha and think that everything that Martha is doing is wrong. And we kind of put Martha and Mary at odds with one another. But if we listen closely to the Gospels, we hear not that Jesus is condemning Martha, condemning her for doing the serving. What he says is, Martha, you are anxious about many things. And so it's the mentality about which Martha is going about her serving. She is all flustered, and she isn't contemplating Christ in the midst of her serving. She's not seeing the literal face of Jesus in the midst of her serving. Because it's not just Jesus she is serving. Jesus brought all of the 12 apostles. And so she's serving Jesus and the apostles. And she's not seeing Christ in all of them. And she's doing it more out of a duty than she is out of this spirit of service. And so we must ask the question of ourselves, how are we going out of our way to serve? Are we being anxious about many things? Are we caught up in our own pride about not going out of ourselves to greet someone whom we've never greeted before? Do we stay in our own little comfort zone, even at Mass, and never go outside of ourselves to go and greet someone we've never met before? Our parish has 600 and some odd families. Have you met every single one of them? And I'm not saying we have to be friends with every single person in the parish. That's almost impossible. But maybe there is someone that you see sitting alone. Maybe it's a family that you don't recognize. Maybe you know of someone, even outside of the parish, who is struggling in their marriage. Maybe you know of someone that has just had their 4th or 5th child, and they need some help. Maybe it's someone that has lost a loved one, and they just need us to console them, or to know that we are present and praying for them. How are we offering hospitality to our own parishioners, to our own brothers and sisters in our parish, and even outside of our parish? St. Paul says in our second reading today from Colossians, "Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake and in my flesh. I am filling up what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ on behalf of his body, which is the church." Christ's sufferings are never insufficient. Make sure we hear that well. Christ's sufferings are not insufficient. They are sufficient. But what St. Paul is saying, that we have to do our part as well. That in order for Christ's sufferings to take effect in our lives, we have to be willing to receive what Christ is willing to give us, and then live that out in our life. We have to be willing to respond to the grace of Christ in our lives. Hospitality is in some way this response of the grace of Christ in our lives. Because there's a twofold aspect of charity, of hospitality. Hospitality falls under the virtue of charity. There is the giving and the receiving. Those who give the hospitality are probably going to suffer a little bit, maybe even give of their means a little bit in order to offer someone a place to stay or offer them food. But there is also the gratitude of the receiver, to not take advantage of the giver. There's that twofold aspect. We are called to always give, even if the receiver does take advantage of us. But if we are on the receiving end of hospitality, to make sure that we are so gracious and that we are not taking advantage. Let us recall Christ in our Gospels and our readings today, that we are called to show hospitality to all people. To the stranger in our own parish, to the stranger on the street, to the stranger that we meet in the store. We are always called to show this great pillar of spirituality, hospitality, service to Christ.